Sonia. Welcome to the show. I'm glad you're joining me. Today we're talking about infidelity and divorce and Christmas and children and how not to do Christmas if these heartbreaking situations are occurring in your home. Why is it so hard to recover from infidelity? How do you handle its impact on your children, especially during the Christmas season? And what if infidelity has led to divorce, which makes it so much harder for us as adults or children to enjoy the holiday season, especially for ex-spouses, parents, children? So what do you do? How do you minimize the impact on your children? And so we're here today with Dr. Jeff Pipe, who is a licensed psychologist. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Dr. Sutherland. Great to be here.
You
Good to
call
see
me
you
Sonia.
again.
We go back. We go way back. I know you asked me this before the show, and I
Wow.
thought, well, that just sounds so weird coming from you.
Well, I've got several other names I'd be glad to call you by.
Okay, wait, let's go back.
Well, maybe we'll go with Sonia for tonight, though.
So Jeff is joining us from Tapestry Psychological Associates, and we'll let you tell us a little bit more about that later on in the
Sure.
show. But I wanted to really start and just ask you, what is it that makes it so difficult for infidelity to just for couples to work through it? What have you seen as just one of the most difficult things that occurs?
Well, I think people grossly underestimate the extent of the damage that it does to a person's heart, mind, and soul when they're that offended spouse, when they discover about that infidelity. And what we know about the mind is that the way it processes and experiences the discovery of an infidelity is traumatic, and the symptoms and just the unfolding of that internally, psychologically, is comparable to the trauma that somebody might experience in a combat situation in terms of the mind's recovery from that.
Yeah.
And so recovery is protracted. It takes an extended period of time. When I'm working with couples that are trying to keep the relationship together, I'll typically tell them 12 to 24 months to get past the intense emotional reaction from that. And just like that, that veteran coming back from a combat situation, anything can trigger a very strong emotional reaction.
So, you say that, and when you say 12 to 24 months to recover from something like that, I bet for folks listening, that just that kind of takes a little bit of weight or pressure off for you. Because, sometimes when you're dealing with a situation like this, there is a tendency for one partner to say, well, why can't you just get over it?
Just get over it.
However many months, right? Or it's been however long. Why is it taking you so long? And even the offended spouse may experience, why is it taking me so long to get over this?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right, and it's hard to be patient, and we put pressure on ourselves if we're on the receiving end, and we put pressure on ourselves if we put pressure on our spouse. And often for that spouse, the offending spouse, the spouse that was in the affair or went outside of the marriage, once the discovery is made, whether it's been a confession or they've been caught, in a lot of ways the monkey is off of their back.
Yeah.
They feel some relief.
Yeah.
They've been living a double life for a period of time and carrying the shame and guilt and all that challenge of holding that double life. So the monkey's off of their back, and so for the first time in weeks, months, years, depending on the circumstance, they feel a sense of freedom, which makes it all the more difficult for them to be gracious with their spouse because that monkey's off their back, but it's jumped onto their spouse's back.
That's a really, really interesting way to put it. It's jumped onto the other spouse's back. And that perspective is probably not one that the offending spouse really even has considered. That it's on the other spouse at this point in time and what that weight feels like. Yeah. And so you talked about triggers, you talked about a lot of different things. So in addition to how long it takes, 12 to 24 months, what's another thing that couples will struggle with significantly along this whole process that makes it so difficult to move forward?
Well, I would say one of the most valuable things, not the only valuable thing, but one of the most valuable things that an offending spouse can do for their spouse is to learn how to really hear from their spouse when they're struggling, when that fear or that pain gets triggered. And particularly for the first several months, that recovering spouse will be on a roller coaster ride. They're going to go through a lot of severe, strong emotions, at times being very angry, which we all would kind of expect and understand.
Right.
At times being just broken and hurting deeply. At other times being terrified. And at other times just desperately grabbing onto their spouse, and suddenly they seem like everything's okay for a small window of time. And often what happens for the offending spouse, who's, again, experiencing some relief, is that they have a hard time really listening to their spouse and hearing their feelings. Often they get put in a defensive spot.
Sure.
Where their spouse may say something that's not necessarily true. Perhaps they misunderstood some aspect of the infidelity, and in their hurt and anger it comes up, and they say something, and that spouse responds defensively, or they say, well, it's not that bad. I was only with her 3 times. It's not like it went on for 3 years.
Right.
And what that communicates to that offended spouse,
Yeah, it's very invalidating.
yes, right, is
Right,
that
right.
that their feelings are not valid, and their pain, their frustration builds, as opposed to those are really golden opportunities for a spouse to for the offending spouse to care for the other,
Yeah.
if they can put their own agenda aside and their own shame and guilt aside,
Yeah.
and really empathize and emotionally, metaphorically hold that partner and care for them.
Yeah, and that's a hard thing to do. You're talking about both spouses. Well, we talked about one, but really we're talking about both spouses
Right.
really at probably different points along the way of recovery, being able to be in the other person's shoes and kind of understand, okay, where is this coming from for this particular person?
Right.
What do I need to understand? What do I need to hear that other person can't maybe say definitively, but is trying to communicate, right? And so when we talk about the idea that for healthy relationships, self-awareness and awareness of others and the feelings of others are so key, right?
Right.
And that inability contributes to situations like this. So really, things that start with where you're in treatment you're working with a couple who's come to you for work with infidelity. But if we go way back, just even before all of that started, we're probably talking about just an difficulty being able to manage through and work with each other in healthy ways, relate with each other in healthy ways, healthy understanding of emotions, healthy
Right.
understanding of other people. And goodness, we could just go way back with that. We could go to childhood if we had enough time.
That's
Yeah.
true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for the spouse, again, that's been caught in the affair, they're swimming in shame and guilt.
Yes.
Yeah.
And even that spouse that's really trying to care for their partner and trying to help them recover, it's challenging to get past that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So finding a way to separate from that, to really process that shame and guilt and be able to move past it, because I would say to that spouse, that is not helpful to your spouse. Your empathy, your warmth, your understanding, inordinately helpful to their healing. Your shame and your guilt is something you're going to have to deal with between you and God.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Yeah.
if Jesus is who He says He is, and we believe that, then we have a place that we can lay that.
And what about those that aren't believers? Where do they lay that?
Yeah, well, that gets challenging. I mean,
Yeah.
how do you deal with that? And in a relationship, I think forgiveness is one aspect of the healing process. And so I think it's important that they take ownership of that and bring that to their spouse, and work through a process of confession, disclosing, confession, and then a request for forgiveness, not just an apology. An apology is easy.
Right.
A request for forgiveness, not so easy.
Right. Exactly.
What does that sound like? How does a request for forgiveness sound different from an apology?
Well, I'm sorry is acknowledging that I've failed, that I've made a mistake. For me to ask you to forgive me is asking you to give me something that in that moment I absolutely do not deserve.
Yeah.
Right.
It's
right.
like your bank calling you and telling you that they've decided to forgive your mortge. I mean,
Wait,
it
they
just,
do that?
it just doesn't, it doesn't happen.
Yeah. Right.
Oh, one could dream.
Yeah, right. But I believe it's that substantial, and I've sat with couples that they can apologize, and they're coming in to sit down with their spouse and request forgiveness, and they get to that word, and I would just ask now, could you, and it just stops. It's right there, and it can't come out, and. Because to be in such a vulnerable place and to ask for so much
Right.
is so challenging, and yet that forgiveness is really the only foundation on which you can build,
Right.
well, any
Right.
relationship, to be frank, but certainly a relationship that's recovering. So there's no way you can make up for it. There's no way you can even that out or make
Right.
some sort of amend that actually offsets the damage that's there.
Yeah.
It's forgiveness or it's
Or
nothing.
Nothing. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I think then of the offended spouse, all right, and the request being made to the offended spouse, would you forgive me? And then I think of all the emotions that run through that person, male or female,
Absolutely.
right?
Right.
When you hear your spouse say, "Can you forgive me?" What is that? What have you seen that to look like for those men or women who are the offended ones, and sitting and across from the other person and hearing, "Will you forgive me?" Because I can hear no. I can hear yes. I can hear no. I can hear I don't know. All of that.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, when I'm able to be a part of that process, my first words to that spouse are, he's going to ask for forgiveness at the end of what he's about to say, and I'm not going to let you respond to it today, because I think it's a big deal.
Right.
I think for me, my way of kind of thinking about that is eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. So this spouse has done harm to you. You have the right now to harm them back. Or to demand some kind of compensation. And of course, if we go down that path, which I think in terms of justice, you have the right to do that. We're poking out each other's eyes and knocking out teeth for the rest of our lives.
Right.
But I think you need to feel the weight and the substance of what it is to release this. It's not a small thing. It's a big thing. And so, let's sit with that for a while and make sure you're at a point of readiness. And there is a single decision to forgive, but really, honestly, forgiveness is a process.
It certainly is.
Yeah.
It certainly is. It certainly doesn't come with the yes, I forgive you, the first time that it's uttered, right? It's an acted out, it's a walked out process.
Yes, definitely
right,
a process.
that they will engage in for who knows how long.
Right.
Another part of the patience walk.
Right.
Well, I mean, part of the damage is it's like throwing that, pebble in a pond and the waves wash out and you don't really fully even recognize the damage that's been done to you until it's months down the road and then, the next year or the next holiday and then you see some new layer of it or you see an effect on your children 6 months or a year down the road. And you didn't know you were forgiving your spouse for these things because you just hadn't seen them unfold in front of you yet. And now you're having to, again, just release another layer of that.
Yeah. And it's almost like, when thoughts come, you walk through that process of forgiveness and you say that you are forgiving of your spouse and thoughts come in your head down the road. Like you said, something happens and something is triggered, and then you have a thought, and then what I've heard is guilt. Okay, but you said you forgave me. Why are you thinking this way now? Why does this come out now? Right? And it's almost as though that offended spouse needs permission to know that if a thought comes in your head and you've offered forgiveness, but something comes in your head and the anger is there or whatever other emotion is there, that's okay too.
Right.
Absolutely.
It is part of your
Yeah.
process.
Absolutely.
Again, it's a process. A process that you go through. It's not going to happen overnight, and you really have to sit back and you have to be patient. The offender has to be patient with that spouse, and they also have to be flexible because of the damage that you've done. It's a huge damage. It takes its toll on both sides.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think it's important for spouses, for couples that are recovering, to understand that forgiveness is one thing, healing is completely
Very
separate,
different.
Yes.
and
yes.
rebuilding trust is completely separate.
Yes.
And I can say I forgive you, and I may still be struggling with trust in you,
Right.
or I may still be hurting deeply, even
Right.
though I've forgiven. And just because I become if I'm crying or I'm angry, doesn't mean that I've picked up that debt again and I'm holding it against you. It just
Right.
means I'm healing. And
Right.
just because I want you to call me when you land at the in the place that you're traveling to doesn't mean I haven't forgiven you. It just means that you're still rebuilding my trust.
Right.
And that happens incrementally
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
across a period of time as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, yeah. How I think of extended family as a couple walks their way through this whole process, and I think of choices that I have observed people make to include extended family in their process or not include extended family in their process. I've even seen choices to include children in their process and not include children in their process. Have you seen anything in your work that just speaks to how couples manage extended family even as they kind of walk their way through things like this?
Well, in my experience, it is a case-by-case basis, and a lot depends upon the quality of the relationship. Kind of my guiding criteria is, do you experience support and aid from your parents, or do they just complicate things?
Yeah.
Right.
And so if
right.
there's a sibling or a parent that is a support, then access that. And
Right.
I mean, I think ideally that forgiveness and healing ripples throughout the family, and ideally everyone can know, so that couple doesn't have to keep a secret or withhold certain things from parents. But we're all broken, fallen
Yeah.
people, and
Right.
Yeah.
some of those parents just are not
They
able
can't
to
do- yeah.
manage that
Yeah.
without either overreacting or underreacting or having their own issues triggered. So I
Yeah,
think you
yeah.
do need to show some discretion
Yeah.
in making that.
Yeah.
And my rule of thumb with the children is somewheres between when they start college and afterwards. It'd probably be good for that offending spouse to talk with their children about it. But unless they've been privy to something and they have some data or they were involved in some way, I would tend to delay that and share something else with the children.
Yeah.
Mom and dad are struggling, which is hard for that offended spouse to say,
Right.
to put some of that on themselves or allow the children to assume that. But I think probably for the sake of not overwhelming the kids with too much and helping to maintain that relationship with the offending spouse.
Yeah.
I think it's probably good to minimize that disclosure until they get older, and then they probably need something that helps them to understand
Yeah.
better.
Right.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, well, we're going to take a break and come right back. We're talking today about infidelity, divorce, children, Christmas, and how maybe we can do Christmas in a way that focuses on the children and minimizes the impact, the negative impact that Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the show. We're here with Dr. Jeff Pipe, who is a psychologist from Tapestry Psychological Associates. Thanks for joining us, Jeff.
I'm glad to be here, Sonia.
So tell me a little bit about your practice. Tell me what led you to the work that you do with couples, And you also do work with sex addiction and a couple of other areas. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing in the field.
Sure. Well, when I was getting started back in the early 90s was really when.
Back when we met.
Yes.
That was the late 90s, right? Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, I was going for a little while there, but I am that old. So,
I'm not.
Thank you for bringing it up.
I'm not.
Yes, that was when the internet was really growing, and so pornography was becoming a bigger and bigger problem for men.
Yeah.
And just kind of seeing the need there kind of drew me into doing a lot of work with guys that were struggling there, and then guys that were struggling with sexual addiction. And as I did that work, I just really came to appreciate the importance of a strong marriage, and also the challenge for these guys as they were making disclosures to their spouses and trying to come clean and do right by their spouses, the challenge of then rebuilding that marriage. And so eventually I shifted my attention towards that other side, towards couples that were recovering from sexual addiction, couples that were recovering from infidelity, and then the last 4 or 5 years, I've tried to kind of develop a skill set around trauma recovery. And again, it just fits hand in glove as I've come to understand, I think as our field, counseling field, has come to understand the post-traumatic reaction that is there for a couple after a disclosure or a discovery is made. I just think a lot of those resources that we know are helpful for those people recovering from kind of capital T traumas are also effective for helping couples recovering from these traumas. So that's a big part of my work.
Yeah.
And I have the pleasure of getting to work with 8 great counselors in my office, and somehow they tolerate me. And so we are
It's a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it.
yeah, well, we are the duct tape and baling wire that hold each other together in doing this work. But.
Awesome. So you talk about trauma as relates to couples work. So talk about the offended spouse and what trauma looks like in the offended spouse.
Well, I think kind of the first obvious and most apparent reaction is they're just struggling with the images and the ideas about their spouse being with somebody else. And again, just like that person who's been a victim of a crime or suffered some other thing that we typically think of as trauma, they have recurrent and intrusive memories of that. So an offending spouse struggles with that. And it can really be triggered by anything.
Yeah.
And, once you've kind of walked through that territory, you become very aware of how many TV shows, how many movies, how many, you just name it, involve some couple scene where there's some kind of infidelity or some kind of extramarital flirtation. And then that just lights them up. And then they're on the emotional roller coaster ride, and waves of pain, waves of fear, and questions about what's real and what's not.
Yeah.
So often they find out that 6 months ago when they thought their spouse was at a movie, they were with somebody else. And, 12 months ago when they thought it was super nice that their spouse gave them this special necklace that they'd been hoping for, that they thought just came out of love, and now they do the math and look at the calendars and realize that that gift probably came from a deep guilt over what was going on. And then there's just that struggle with what's real now? Was the whole relationship just a mask, just a facade? You were just staying in it for the kids. They can't tell it, and usually that's not the case. Yeah. Usually there were, very real aspects of the relationship, and there was love, but then there's this, this betrayal that was going on.
Yeah. And so when you think about the idea of these the offended party being able to recover from the trauma. And we talk about 12 months, 24 months. We're talking about that is a large part of why it takes so long to in addition to all the other factors, but why that contributes to why it takes so long to really be able to move forward. And in the scope of things, it's not a long time, not really, to
Right.
really overcome trauma in the formal sense, as well as build trust in not just the other person, but trust in yourself, your own judgment, your own, is what I'm
Yes,
thinking
that's very well
the
said.
right, can I even trust how I think about things or how I see things?
I was fooled. How can I know
Yes.
what's real and what
Yeah.
again? Yeah,
Yeah.
right. I thought they were there. I believed them. I had that kind of feeling in my gut that something didn't add up, something wasn't right, and I ignored it.
Yeah.
Or maybe I don't even remember a feeling in my gut. I was just utterly fooled.
I
but
missed it completely. Yeah.
yeah, how do I trust myself
Yeah,
again?
yeah. So now we're in this Christmas season, and there are, of course, going to be families that are struggling, couples that are struggling with this in real time. And it's December, and they have children. And so, obviously, most of them will want to protect their children as much as possible. But sometimes that's hard when you're in the middle of an emotional roller coaster, when you're in the middle of trauma and emotional turmoil. Sometimes you don't recognize some of the things that are happening for your children, or you don't
Right.
recognize that there are things that you should or could be doing. You can just focus on the pain that you feel right at the moment. What do we say to couples who are going through it right now with kids and they've got to figure something out?
Yeah, that's tough because
Yeah.
often the holidays alone can be a trigger
Okay.
for those couples. And so, like you said, that offended spouse is going to be wrestling and hurting. And, kind of my default encouragement, which is easy to say and not easy to do, is as much as you can for the sake of the kids during this time, try and table it.
Yeah.
And if your spouse is there, try and take off the gloves as much as you can. Again,
Right.
that's easy to say. It's not easy to do
Right.
because that emotion can be so strong. But and try and keep it out of the kid's path whenever possible. If you're able to, when you get triggered and you find yourself tearing up, try and bug out of there, get back to a bedroom, minimize the impact on the kids. But if you can't conceal it from the kids, offer some explanation. Again, I would discourage somebody from getting into the details
Right.
of disclosing it, certainly, but be able to tell your kids, Mommy's just having a hard time today,
Sure,
or Daddy's
sure.
struggling today. He's just feeling sad because of some things he can't explain.
Yeah.
Depending on the age of the kids.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I was gonna say, how do you that spouse or that couple go through that situation when the kids are gone, when it's just them there, and how they dealing with the holidays then when it's just the two, and then it's going to be them separate. How do they deal then?
Yeah, you mean when the children are grown? and-
Right.
yeah, you're going to have to be working through it. Yeah.
Right, because now you have it's just you that without that support,
Right. Right.
you know.
So you're saying the loneliness
Right.
that will come and the depression, that's a part of it anyway, but now there's no buffer. It's just
Right.
you and your emotions by yourself in a house or an
Right.
apartment that you have to deal with if you're separated and going through that whole thing, is what
Right.
you're saying.
Right.
Yeah. And when things like that happen, two things, well, for that, and then I want to go back for a second to something that you said too, Jeff. Planning is really important. Knowing that this is a vulnerable time that's coming up, plan activities that
Yes.
you can try to be involved in.
Right.
And as much as you may not want to, don't feel like it, in a time like this, we can't always let our feelings run us. And we kind of have to intentionally engage to distract ourselves from just dwelling in the pain, that you can't, that you just have to work through. but sometimes just being structured and just knowing, okay, I go to work from 9 to 5, but it seems like every night at 8 o'clock something hits me, right? So recognize it. Talk with your therapist about it. Plan for that time and have something that you're going to engage in. On the weekends when you're not working, plan something, right? And make a routine for yourself to kind of help you be able to just day after day, just walk your way through as you talk to your therapist, as you kind of just work through the pain that's happening.
Right.
And then when you were talking earlier just around how to deal with children, and it seems to me that it would be a very good idea for parents to talk amongst themselves first. When something happens, let's do this as much as possible. If couples can talk through this with their therapist and plan for the eventuality of a kid asking a question, or somebody breaking down and crying, or something triggering you on the and being prepared for those types of things, right? Nothing goes perfectly. No plan ever, doesn't go awry, but still, a plan is helpful. Better than no plan, and then you're kind of floundering through, okay, well, what do I do? What do I say?
Yeah, and if you're too raw, and you may be, then again, with your spouse, come up with a script. I encourage couples to do that. Here's what we're going to say, and preemptively talk to the kids.
Yeah.
Don't wait for them to come to you. You go to them. If you just know you're going to be too raw, and you and your spouse together say, hey, Mom and Dad are going through a hard time. You may notice we've been a little bit tense or short with each other, and but we're going to work through it, and we're going to get in a better place, and give them something. But yeah, the two of you be a unified front. Go to them together if you can do that, and agree to the script, and agree to here's what we're going to say, here's what we're not going to say. And so if the kids do come later and they question, here's what we're going to say, here's what we're not going to say. And that may be different for different kids. If you have a 10-year age gap between your children, you may say one thing to your 15-year-old and something very different to your 6-year-old.
Yeah. And the other thing too, we're talking a lot about couples who can actually communicate and make that happen.
Right.
There are an equal number of couples who there's no having a conversation.
Right.
There is no agreeing to anything. Right? And so what do you do? And my encouragement is always get to a counselor. Get to a counselor. Even if you're not counseling for reconciliation, you're counseling because you have children in the mix. And you've got to figure something out for those children's sake. Right? And it's hard to, when that anger is there, oh my gosh. And I've seen that
I see it would be hard for both individuals as far as seeking help, and I think that's one of the key things we need to get people to recognize is that that's going to be a difficult time for you going through, and there's nothing wrong with seeking help. Don't be ashamed to look for that support that you don't have within that relationship, because it's not easy to do it alone, and to have that someone to listen, to let you vent, to be able to talk through things. Like we said, it's a process, and the only way to get through it is walking through that process. It's easier to walk through a process when you have someone to walk with you. So, I'm just like you, Dr. Sutherland. I'm a big advocate in talking with someone, getting a counselor. If you don't have a counselor, you find someone, that neutral party that you can talk with, that's not going to be judgmental.
Oh gosh. Can you say that N word again? Neutral?
Yes, a neutral party. Someone that's not going to be judgmental. And that's the biggest problem when we start talking to friends, is that they're going to want to take that individual side, and they're not going to be neutral. They're not going to sit there and listen. It's hard to find that person. So,
it is.
That's where, counseling comes in.
Jeff, do couples wait a long time before getting help?
Well, I think some do, and some don't. I mean, I think if there's anything that's going to create a crisis, this would be the kind of thing that's going to light a fire and get somebody moving. But yeah, I mean, I hope couples reach out for help and move quickly, because there are those couples that come in and they delayed, and either there was a revenge affair. Or there was another affair because they never really fully healed, and that disconnect and tension that remained in the marriage left the one spouse not with an excuse for why they acted outside of the marriage again, but it just was a more challenging situation. So, I mean, I just think that recovery is super important, and I would say, and adding on to what Juan was saying a minute ago. I think I encourage couples that just a counselor is not even enough. You need a good friend. And I say ideally one or two friends, and they need to be friends that are approved by your spouse, which is usually the best way to find that more neutral party. And most couples, when they really put some work into it, they're able to find that one. So. You, the offending spouse, you need somebody to walk with you, because there's going to be times when you're pulling your hair out with your spouse and you just need to vent. But it needs to be somebody that your spouse trusts. And they know that this person's pro-marriage, and they know this person's neutral, and they know this person has enough emotional intelligence, enough relational maturity. Sometimes they'll let you vent. Other times they're going to call you out. And same way for that offended spouse who's recovering. And they need somebody there with them. At least one person, ideally two, because they need to be talking. Because just like any other trauma, if you start avoiding it and just trying to hold it down and bottle it up, it's only going to make it worse. So you need somebody to be able to process it with, because that's part of the recovery. And I wouldn't necessarily say you need to be talking all the time, but you really need some key opportunities a couple of times a week, ideally, just to be able to talk with somebody.
And so that answers the question just around the offended spouse being able to communicate his or her thoughts to the offending spouse, and that person being able to hold it. And it answers the question of, well, should they be able to hold everything? Well, maybe not, depending on where you are in recovery, and depending on, and so that having those outside people that you talk to, that allows some of that to come out in addition to your counselor, right? And then when you're able to talk with your spouse, then you're not offloading everything to that one person, which is difficult to hold for that one person all the time. So I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask you anyway.
Can you write down the answer and slide it over to me so I make sure I get it right?
Sliding right now. Is there hope for couples who are dealing with infidelity, who are not yet divorced? Can couples recover?
Absolutely. Absolutely, there's hope. Did I get it right?
Got it right.
Okay, good. I mean, it's not an easy path, and there are some couples where that wound is so deep that they're not able to recover, that they're just not able to rebuild that trust. But for many couples, I want to say most couples, yes, there's hope, and that is a process. Again, a year to 2 years of the intense feelings. But, like I think you were alluding to earlier, Sonia, it's the alternative is this being single or hitting a reset button and starting anew with somebody else. And often the recovery time and then the quality of a relationship for couples that are able to lean in and both spouses really working on it, the quality of that intimacy and ability to be honest, because your worst dirt, the worst nightmare is out there.
Has happened, sure.
And you've been able to work it through, and usually there's a level of vulnerability, openness, honesty that is exceptional for those couples that persist. But that doesn't come in a month or 2 months or 6 months. You know, that's years down the road. But
well worth it, though.
yes.
Well worth it, yeah. So what would you say to those who have gone ahead and separated and divorced and are going through this period? Can you just talk to work that you might do, or talk to things that you might say to a man or a woman post-divorce? Just going through the Christmas season and just dealing with the aftermath, the residue of having been in an adulterous relationship.
Yes, for the recovering, the offended spouse.
Yes, for the offended spouse, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I first want to express some compassion for them, because I know this is a very hard season. The holidays are a very hard season. You know, and if this is your first season apart from your spouse, you know, their absence is going to be glaring on Christmas morning and with the family on Christmas Eve, and every one of those traditional events is going to mark that, and every one of those events is at the very least going to be a moment of loss and sadness, and at the worst, it's potentially a trigger for the pain and the fear and the thoughts around the infidelity. I want to say some of the same things that, you know, don't be alone. You know, you need help. You need a professional, but you also need a couple of good friends. So reach out and grab onto them. And you know, that's especially for guys, because you know, guys are not the only ones that are the offending spouse. Sometimes they're on the other end of that, and guys in particular seem to have a hard time really reaching out and asking for help from their friends. And I encourage guys, you know, you ought to, particularly through a time like the holidays, you know, at the very least 1 hour a week, you know, you're getting together with a buddy. And you know, we're busy, guys are busy, and so are women, but guys, so it may not be the same person every week. You know, you may have a crew of 3 or 4 guys, and you're going to get together with this guy every other week, that guy once a month, the other guy every couple of weeks, but just have somebody there, because you need to be able to process it. And I would also say, you know, lean into, now you may take a break at the holidays from leaning into those things that trigger you, but you have decisions to make about what sort of real estate, metaphorically speaking, you want to reclaim, and what things you're just going to avoid. So there may be places that are reminders for you, and you may, during the holidays, decide you're going to give yourself a break. You know, maybe it's a certain hotel chain where you knew your spouse met somebody, and now you drive past that, and every time you go past it, it triggers you. And maybe it's a certain part of town. Maybe it's a certain place that you know your spouse who traveled connected with that affair partner. And so, you know, at times you may choose to give yourself a break, and you're just going to avoid that. And maybe this is the holidays are a time to give yourself a break. At other times, I would say if those places, those interactions, those people are important to you, you earn them back. And how you do that is by leaning into them, going to them, walking through them, trying to stay relaxed, using those times to try as best as you can stay grounded, but don't avoid them. Every time you go and confront one of those places or people or circumstances that are triggering for you, your reaction gets a little bit smaller, especially if you can stay calm and grounded while you're there in the presence of that trigger. But every time you do that, it gets a little bit smaller. Every time you avoid it, it gets a little bit bigger. Now, there are some things you can avoid. You know, maybe, I don't know, say, you know, your spouse met somebody in some small Texas town somewheres, and you can just never go to that town again. And that's fine. But often,
to spend the last few minutes that we're talking just to talk about the children, right?
Yes.
Because they suffer the most when they know of these things, and then if divorce happens, they really do suffer quite a bit. And during the Christmas season, especially, is difficult for children to have to deal with parents who are separated or divorced and maybe disagreeing, haven't come to a space where they are reconnected just as parents and individuals. And so those children on a regular basis are managing through that conflict, and now it's Christmas, right? And so now it's heightened, right? So what can we do? What can parents do to kind of help with that? You know, the traditional things are split the holidays, right? So Thanksgiving, Christmas, or Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, spend one day with one parent and then the other day with the other parent, right? That's a typical way that folks do it. Or they'll spend one holiday with one parent, the other holiday with another parent, right? Those are some typical things. And, you know, those are difficult too for
Right.
children. Those
Right.
are still very difficult for children,
Right.
even with those types of arrangements.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting that you say that the difficulty that they go through. And from what I see, I can say I think that one thing that will help would be to continue traditions. Don't stop doing what you used to do because of the separation or the divorce. You might want to try new traditions,
Yeah,
add new things into it,
yeah,
but continue to have traditions with your children. Continue to do things that that give them that happy moment. Give them that euphoric feeling of the holidays. So you want to not only continue traditions, but also develop new traditions. You know, so I think that would be one of the key things that I
Yeah.
would probably say would be big for both sides, is to make new traditions and continue with some of the old traditions.
yeah. And, you know, I like the idea of continuing with old traditions. When you say that, the picture that comes into my head, right, is Christmas, cookies, just the decorations around the house. You know,
Right.
even though the other parent is not there,
Right.
normalcy from the sense of don't stop doing those types of things
Exactly.
becomes really important for
Right.
them, right?
Right. Right.
And so go the extra mile to bake the extra cookies or
Right.
put the extra candy out. Oh, they don't need any more candy. Well, I'll just give you a little bit more.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So just remember to do those types of things.
Yes.
And then I do like the idea of starting new traditions as well. And those can be new traditions that mom starts and then a new tradition that dad starts.
Right.
And so
Right.
now they have two new traditions in addition to the normalcy that you maintain for them
Right.
with some of the older traditions that you used to have, right? And so that can help. The other thing is, so I'm going to say this at the risk of just sharing the time together still at some point in the holiday where mom and dad put it aside and everybody's back in the same space, right? Now, that has its pros and cons to me, right?
Right.
I can see that it could be a helpful thing just in terms of your children being able to see you in the same space, talking
Right.
and setting aside differences because this is important time
Right.
and putting them first.
Right.
I can see the difficult side of that because we also know that in situations where there's not going to be reconciliation, we don't want to create a false sense of hope in children that this represents something that it really doesn't represent. And so the conversation, the discussion becomes really important
Right.
then when you have discussions with your children about something like that, how it's going to go or not going to go, what it means, what it doesn't mean, what's the reason behind doing this, what do you think of if mom and dad did this, and getting their thoughts and kind of hearing how they feel about it, right? And really being open and honest and really being able to create space for them to give input to that as well.
Right.
No, it could go either way.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't know.
I think that's where that new tradition could actually come in, where when you're spending time together, it does, you got this house to that house. You have two different households. So let's find a happy medium, someplace where we can have a traditional, actual family gathering together. That's where that new tradition can come in. And also, I think the most important thing is that you don't want to give the misconception to the children that mom and dad are working through things if things aren't going to be worked through.
Right.
I think you want to just make sure that you don't give them that false sense of hope that they're going to, that you're going to get back together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thing too, when I think of situations where parents share the day, so part of the day or Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, or part of Christmas, part of the conflict that can arise if somebody's late or whatever. There almost needs to be a decision, and I say this knowing that yes, there are parents out there who will take advantage of this.
Right.
But sometimes choosing not to battle on the holiday is a choice that we can make.
Right.
Even if we feel like it's not fair, and it may not be fair, but at the end of the day, if we're creating chaos for our children, it doesn't matter. The fairness doesn't matter because
Right.
all they experience is the chaos that's been created for them
Right.
on a day and a season that's supposed to be happy for
Right.
them,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so,
Yeah, if there's any way that those parents can, this is going to sound harsh, but kind of get over themselves for a day or two or a meal
yeah.
for the sake of the kids, if you can pull that off. And now some people they're just not going to be able to pull that off, in which case it's too risky. And,
Yeah.
Right.
but, if you can, and I will regularly work with couples that end up separated before they've made any decisions, and I'll encourage them during those times. Yeah, put it aside. Spend a couple days back in the same place. Let the kids kind of have that stability for a moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I heard about a great idea. I've never done this. I wish I had thought of it because I'm divorced. I wish I had thought of it at the time. Do a video recording that you send to your kid when they're at the other parent's house that is only just happy, Merry Christmas. I hope you're having a great time.
Oh, nice.
Just something nice, nothing about the other person,
Right.
nothing to take away from them being there, just knowing that kids will miss you,
Yes.
right?
Right.
They don't
That's
really
great.
want to be separated,
Right.
but they're forced into a situation of your creation, not theirs,
Right.
right?
I love that idea.
Yeah, that's a beautiful idea.
Yeah.
Because often that kid is feeling a sense of angst because I
Yeah.
feel like I've betrayed mom because I'm
Right,
here with
right.
dad, or vice versa.
Right.
I love that idea.
Yeah, that's a great idea because, like you said, I think it would help to relax that child while they're there. It will give them another sense of joy.
Yeah.
It will let them know that mom or dad, whoever they're not with, loves them, unconditionally.
Yep. And make sure that you include in the video, have a good time
Yes.
where you are.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Make sure you include that and don't just say,
Right.
miss you, wish you were here. That doesn't necessarily help. That just
Right.
kind of potentially could add to that angst, right?
Right.
So give them permission. Tell them you miss them.
Yes.
Tell them you love them. Tell them have a good time,
Yes.
right? See you whenever you get back home.
Right.
Yeah, anything you can do that supports that other relationship. That child needs two parents.
Yes.
Right.
And even though there's a divorce, anything you can do to strengthen that bond with their other parent is fantastic.
Yeah. And another idea that I really like is making intentional memories, right? Creating space where you are actually doing something together and being intentional about it. And whether it's an idea that you have or an idea that you sit down with your kids with and come up with and say, well, let's make a memory. What do we want to do? And just dedicate that time and spend it with them and make a memory and then document the memory, right? Make a memory book, something, and then maybe you add to that every year. Maybe that's a tradition.
Yeah, that's
Right?
that
Maybe you
tradition building.
add
Yeah.
a new memory to that new memory book that you're starting, that you guys come up with that thing to do at the holiday, whatever.
Right.
But those are just, we as parents, it is on us. It is our responsibility
Right.
to make Christmas good for our children. It is completely on us. It is not our children's responsibilities to understand the pain that we're going through. As developmentally, that's not their job, right? Their
Right.
job is to be a child and to be raised. And that's
Right.
pretty much it.
Right.
Our job is to be the adult and make sure that Christmas is good for our
Right.
children. And
Right.
set ourselves aside for a minute, hard as it can be. And I know it can be difficult, but we got to be adults
Right.
and just do what we got to do and be there for our children, especially in a season like this.
Preach
So-
it.
So parents, I encourage you, you're going through a difficult time like this, with issues like these, at a significant time of the year like this. Our prayers are with you. You're not on an easy journey, but I hope that the things that we talked about here are helpful for you, and we're praying that you have a wonderful season. See you guys next week. Have a great